Hello everyone, and welcome to Mastering the Art of Magical Effects in Houdini. My name is Jaden Patterson, and thank you for joining this workshop. I'm just going to quickly try and describe everything we'll be covering in the 8 weeks. So it's split into 8 weeks in total. 4 of those weeks we'll be dealing with one production style shot. So that's this one over here. I've tried to form this into more of a shot production style than a standard tutorial, just so that the actual effects we're working on we need to deal with in a sort of live fashion. So we need to be considerate of the type of camera used, the distance from camera, take all of that into account while we're working on the effects. So we will work on the first effect in the initial 4 weeks. The first effect will be the portal over here. So that will take 2 weeks of our time to work on the portal, starting with the basic setup of the scene and this shot over here. Looking for reference, general inspiration for this type of effect. Also touching a little bit on the difference between generating more magical style effects for fantasy versus the more sci-fi type of effect we're going for here in these shots. On top of that, we'll start to work on the basics of most good general magic setups for the portal, which starts out with a standard volume simulation, and then we get quite involved in the advection of the particles. We start to play with what we can do with the particle sims after the sim and see how far we can take it. In general, I think the first week will be a good introduction to the way I work personally, to my workflow, and to how I approach using Houdini as an artist. In general, I would not describe myself as a TD. I'm not the most technical person, and so if you're looking for someone to teach you how to do a nested for loop instead of a copy stamp inside of a compile network, I'm not that person. I am much more an artist first. So my approach has always been, when I picked up Houdini, was I needed to make something work. I needed to make sure the pictures look good. How can I bend Houdini to my will to make that happen? And that's kind of been my approach ever since. So this first effect in this shot is a broad stroke introduction to that kind of part of my workflow, and how we can very simply and very quickly get complex looking effects just by using some of the more simple style tools that we have available. So I hope you find that interesting, and in terms of the general stuff we'll be looking at during the entire course, I hope there's a more emphasis on the artistic aspect of it and less on getting bogged down by a lot of the technicalities or the technical details. So moving on, after the portal, we'll be taking a look at the second effect here in weeks 3 and 4, which is this magical shield. So once again, a few of the same elements will apply and techniques, but with a few extra things to go on top of that. So a little bit extra on the shading, some more interesting lighting aspects, and then obviously we also deal with the secondary effects that surround our main magic over here. So we'll be doing the bullets, the impacts, all that smoke and everything you see there. In week 3, we'll basically do pretty much the bulk of the work on the shield. So procedurally setting up the shield, how it's placed in the scene, how big it is, and then the particles and advection workflows we use to generate the main part of that effect in that shot. And in week 4, we'll add a bunch of the extra elements. So make sure we've got some really interesting layers, maybe some extra details on that shield, and all of the environmental effects and lighting as well. I should mention that for both of these effects and for all of the effects in this workshop, they all involve a fair amount of compositing. And with magic in general, you will find that magic in particular does need quite a lot of compositing, in a way that sort of destruction or purely volumetric effects work might work without compositing. Magic can really be taken to the next level in comp. So we do spend a fair amount of time in comp as well, going through that. And whether you're using Nuke or Fusion, you should be able to follow along for the most part. At this point, I think Fusion is still actually free, so if you are interested in picking it up, they're not that different, and you can get used to Fusion if you know Nuke quite easily, I think. I actually use both at the moment. Moving on from that, from week 5 to 8 is another shot, which I'll show you here. This is our decloak and our EMP shockwave effects. So at this point we jump into a completely different shot, different camera, different environment, and a different main character type thing here. So once again, hoping to learn a few extra techniques that I generally use to drive the unwrapping or unfolding animation of this drone object. We generally call that a decloak. It's an invisible object and it's becoming visible before it does its magic power. So a bunch of extra stuff involved here that we would not have tackled in the previous effects, such as those lines and the electrical arcs traveling on the surface, and then a little bit of a more detailed SOP-based geometry editing as well. I would say this particular effect also has some slightly more advanced shading techniques. Nothing too crazy, but we do spend some time in the shader, and then a pretty complicated composite as well. Then moving on into the last 2 weeks of the course, we tackle this EMP effect, which kind of the goal with this one was to try and bring together a bunch of the techniques we had used in the previous effects to see if we can apply them to something completely different. So here we've got this shockwave, we have impact dust, we have some magical element in the middle of the shot, and we have quite a lot of electricity, some shading as well, and just general effects lighting. So just to recap, I think we pretty much tackle everything and every technique I use to deal with magical style effects. In this course it is definitely a lot more sci-fi focused, but every single one of these elements is very applicable to a fantasy style, for example. So magic is magic at the end of the day, and what directors and clients want to see is these energy related elements. The electrical effects have their part in that magical list as well, along with the advected particles that we render here and rasterize in this shot as well. In terms of following along with me as I'm working through the course, I do try and not move too quick, but at the same time it would be beneficial if you have some knowledge of Houdini already and are quite comfortable moving around. I'll cover that in another video just to discuss the prerequisites. But in general, what I want anyone who does this course to get out of it, and even if that's someone who's very experienced and can already do all of this stuff and they have their own methods and techniques, is more to take away my own personal viewpoint, and that is, make sure to always keep the art first, unless you're going out to actually become a TD specifically. I think everyone would agree the most important thing is, what does the end product look like? And so my method of using Houdini is just make sure I'm constantly looking at the end product. I don't care how deep my networks go, how advanced, how many angles I use. At the end of the day, I consider myself to be using very simplistic approaches in Houdini to achieve as complex looking art as I can. And so it's more of a guerrilla style use of Houdini to get maximum effect on the final image. So I hope in some capacity you latch on to that kind of message in the course, and at least take away that fundamental want to experiment and test out and use that approach yourself, to focus on the art and to use Houdini in a way that makes creating that art pretty easy for you. So with that said, welcome to Mastering the Art of Magic, and I'll see you guys in the next few weeks.